Monsieur Buren, you are normally considered as one of the pioneers of conceptual art, sort of reappropriation of the ready-made, etc. But at the same time, you were and still are a painter. More than that, a colorist, fundamentally a retinal artist. So beyond the central position of the visible and the conceptual, I would say that you are one of the few artists from the 60s generation, starting in the 60s, that try to think through color, to deal with the conceptual dimensions of seeing as thinking. How do you consider this?
It's a vast question. First of all, even at the very early beginning, and I, I can see in a very different way that I developed after during the time, I was always very intrigued and very interested by the fact of color, what the meaning of color, etc., etc. To the point that in many exhibition where I was invited, group exhibition around the theme of concept art, which I criticized very heavily from the very beginning with some text, but also with what I was showing. And for example, and I am going back to the very first exhibition of so-called conceptual art, which was, I think, 69. Knowing and seeing all my friends and the tendency of the time where all the supposedly conceptual artists were working mainly, I have nothing against that, but mainly with black and white, with gray. Maximum was maybe to use some brown. I was very intrigued with this kind of academism before even this school, let's say school, was even working. It was the very first exhibition, and then it was followed by a dozen of these exhibitions, more or less under the same title. And then the majority, not to say everyone, and you can take people from Lawrence Weiner at that time to Jan Wilson, to any one of the participants, Joseph Kossuth, etc. All the work were black on white. Not to say black is not a color, even white, but that's it. And I was immediately thinking it's something there which I found really strange, and also which was more or less meaning serious art is black and white, which means automatically color is not serious. And of course, my little way to participate in this exhibition, which was usually either uh, not really spectacular or even rejected, was immediately to use as much as possible colored works. So that was either with a linen, either with a paper print glued on the wall. But each time, the only spot in the show, which was white and red or white and blue or white and green, etc., that was the only thing which was not black and white and possibly gray or, as I said, brown. So just to start or even finish also about your question, my interest for the color was from the very early beginning, and I continue to work and not being afraid either to red or blue, but to be very attracted, and also strongly playing and working with color, as far also as the fact that I think basically in the field of visual art, what is purely uh, a way of thinking outside of the word, outside of music, and outside of poetry, in the visual art, what can be really the way to think is getting through the color. The color is, to my point, even today, the only thing you cannot really describe. You cannot
Uh-huh.
really speak about. You can speak for hours about color, but you cannot really speak. And I often take this example that look to a dictionary, the definition of color. It's one of the funniest thing you can see, because they will take a name and they will make the description, turning around the fact that red is red. And then you have no definition of what is red. And as we know as well, all together, that we don't know exactly uh, how do you feel and how do you react if you see red or blue, compared to the artist who is going to red or blue. So it's a kind of, not to say mysterious, but very interesting aspect of visual art, which I think the most absolutely, how to say it, without word, which is a way to think directly uh, with uh, with no filter, to try to transmit or to say something, is by the mean of color.
It's
And I
interesting.
think it's the, sorry, no, no. I think it's the only fundamental aspect, in connection with a lot of other aspects which are inside the visual art, where we have this kind of vivid way to think without passing by words.
Hmm. Hmm. I think this is very interesting because uh, in one aspect we can say that the 0 degree, the degree zero from painting is color instead of the picture plane or whatever. It's color, which is the basic element of the visual world, what is specific to the visual world. And on the other hand, it's something that is specific but is always relational, as Matisse always said. 1 centimeter of blue is different from 1 meter of blue, and the blue besides a yellow is different from a blue beside a red. So it's always relational, and it's basic and relational, which means that it's always a way of seeing in time. Color is always in time, and it's always the same, and it's always different. That's the difficulty of defining it in a dictionary, because you have to find out a situation which is general, and color is never general. Don't you think so?
I think it's correct. I think
Yeah.
it's the main reason I am interested in working and using color for what I feel. Of course, I have a lot of way to touch the color, like even not to make my taste inside the color, etc., which is a big task, because color also bring a lot of personal thing, and I try as much as possible to bring very little personal thing inside and with it. So I have some, I built little by little during the years a series of way to use the color, the way to restrict the color, the way to select colors, etc., etc. But always with this kind of focus about the fact, the use of color it's for me the most interesting possibility to work with visual art, and also make even clearer why I was very suspicious from the very first beginning. And being invited, I use this situation of being invited to also open a deep criticism about conceptual art, because I think art cannot be reduced, visual art cannot be reduced with a speech or with a phrase or playing with all these concepts. It's a way to use that word during that period.
Uh-huh.
But
And then,
also because the real concept in terms of something which has its own complete specific language is
mhm,
specifically the color.
mhm,
And the funny thing is to see, even if with the time, a lot of these things are not so clear anymore, but it's evident that almost all the people who were participating in this group show were avoiding completely the use of color. Yeah,
yeah,
unless the black, the white, and gray.
yes, yes. And then in in the late 60s, you left the studio and you went to work in the public space, directly in the streets with your posters, your striped posters. And they were both political and pictorial. And but that period around 68, it was a very discursive period. So to produce and disseminate this very undiscursive, colorful, striped posters in the streets, was it considered at that time apolitical?
You mean political or no political?
No political, because there were no words.
It was frustrating for most of the people, but I think this frustration was really political,
Yeah. Yes, 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 yes.
especially because it was also, I mean, not to say it was successful, but it was also fighting with, for example, the numerous images everywhere in the city speaking about the publicity, for example. So, especially using the billboard, no one was expecting in a billboard something which show nothing, and especially not an image and not a text, and not both the image and the text. So, I mean, to just speak about a small anecdote, one night when I started, I worked at night. I thought it was a little safer than during the day, which was wrong. After that, I worked during the day, which was much safer. But one time I was catched by the police, and I was working with a little car. And in the car, I was having the glue and the paper. And I was finishing to cover a publicity, a wall with the stripes. And they said, "Okay, so where do you put your stuff, etc." I said, it's here in that car. Okay, can we see? So they opened the car, they look, and they said, okay, that's the material we can see here, but now show where is the material with the text you are writing. So I'm very sorry, it's no text. Yeah, but you have a kind of a word or something. And they were really sure you cannot do that for nothing. And then they really looked to the car and they said between them, it's incredible. There's no text. It's really only that. And they said, okay, go ahead. We don't care.
I thought they arrested you. You should have text.
So just to say that if people were taking care for some reason, here the police, uh, they were really completely surprised about the fact that why someone was spending time to glue something, which was today I don't do it for one, at least not where I am sure many people at least know, if they don't know my work, they know a little bit about. And I don't think I can do it anymore because if people recognize and immediately said, "Oh, that's some guy named Buren or whatsoever," the the main reason I was working like that is not functioning anymore. So I don't. If I do something outside, which is very often, it's not in doing such works. But at that time, it was really not only fresh but also a little bit radical. And of course, when people were taking attention, automatically it was, I will say, political by the fact it was having no direct meaning or no anything you can really control.
Monsieur Buren, I read, I think in an interview or in an essay that you wrote, how important the studio of Mondrian, the Schwitter's Meersbau, or the Van Doesburg Café were to you and to your work and this relationship of painting and architecture, for instance. And all of them, Mondrian, Schwitters, and Van Doesburg, they are also very influential to Latin American concrete, new concrete, kinetic artists at that period. For instance, Hélio Itisica, Cruz Dias, and even Almir Mavinier, who worked in the 50s at and and then started in the 60s with his additive posters. Uh, were you at some point closer to this group of kinetic artists, concrete artists from Latin America that were in Europe, in Paris, or in Germany, or in England, or critics like Guy Brett who were quite familiar with them, or a gallery like Signals in London? How was the dialogue, or it didn't happen at all?
When they were very active in Paris, they were part of the artistic life in Paris, and very important. I was much younger, and I saw many of the work or the show they did. So I was more or less following their work. And I met some of these people, especially in the late 60s, not before. I get quite close with Julio Le Parc, for example, and I met some others. And I I was, I mean, I was at that time especially extremely, let's say, radical in what I wanted to do, and even not knowing what I will really do. But just to say that I was easy to reject almost everything, including what they were doing. But to be a little more balanced, I think some of the work, maybe especially people like Soto and Julio Leparc, uh, were uh, in a way very interesting when the work was getting someplace outside of the visual effect. I
Mm.
was certainly critical of the tendency of people like Vasarely, etc., even if they were different, about the visual effect being the prime aspect of the work, even if it was maybe not what they wanted. but the people who were really going out at that period, especially from the pure visual effect, were, I think, extremely interesting. And for example, Soto, with the kind of what they called penetrable, etc., was certainly something very different compared to all the rest, and extremely intriguing, I think.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I certainly get even more interested by these works 15 years later than I was in the late 60s.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's difficult because I know at that time I was really rejecting almost everything which was happening as soon as it was just too much. I was really extremely, in a way, negative about the production of art, etc., etc. So that
Hmm.
was considered for my way of thinking, like to do too much, to do too many variation, etc., etc. And I changed quite a lot. But at that time, if I have to be clear, uh, I was really more or less pushed out because of what could have been, in fact, the quality of their work.
Hmm. Hmm. Uh, During the 1972 documenta, the Harold Zeman documenta, yourself and other artists were quite critical to his attitude of transforming the exhibition in a work of art. Uh, Nonetheless, wasn't something similar to that your strategy when you did your retrospective at the Pompidou in 2002, entitled Le Musique n'existait pas, in which you made a huge installation that transformed completely the museum, both in its spatial and institutional dimensions? Wasn't it the exhibition as a work of art?
Uh, maybe that's true, but I don't see where you can make any comparison with these two things, you know. Harald Zeman, for me at that time, and of course, since his time, I must say, thing has been getting much worse. So I I open my criticism about what, in my eyes, was coming the organizer or the curator of an exhibition directly to the person who, not only at that time, but even today, when we compare to what we can see in the big group show, Biennale, etc., was from far the best of all. So my criticism was, I think, taking, for example, the one who should eventually be completely safe from my criticism. But he opened the door about what we see today. And so that's the reason I don't see the connection you are doing, uh, of an organizer of an exhibition who, in fact, take advantage of the people he select and the way he presents the show, not to take care of the artists who are showing, but to take care of his or her idea about art, about philosophy, about whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And that was already visible because I was not able to invent what did happen 20 years later. So, in a way, it was also existing already with Zeman. But I make, I force to show something very specific of the beginning of an age where little by little the artist become less and less important, and more than less a kind of a puppet into the hand of the people who are making this kind of exhibition. But of course, if an artist and not the curator is doing an exhibition, to say the full exhibition it's a work of art has nothing to do with saying that what did a curator to do an exhibition, the full exhibition is a work of art.
Mm-hmm.
Unless the curator become to be, as I said at that time about Zeman, the only artist in the show. But when I do my own show and I work, if someone said, but you are making a work of art, I will say, yes, I am not a butler, I am just an artist. And even if I don't like the term, working in a museum, I will have a very bad way to speak, like to say, but I am not an artist, so what I am. So at least, and when people said, if I do something in the street, especially if it's not official, I am an artist. I said, no, no, I am someone who does something specific. Now, if you think I am an artist, or as you said at the beginning, that I am a painter, in front of me, okay, you can say that, but I don't consider myself as a painter at all. Now, when you said that I am a painter, I will go back to the question. So, can you define how I am a painter? Because if I am a painter, I know great painters I have nothing to do with. So,
Mm-hmm.
either the term is completely empty and it's better not to use it, which is what I am doing. I don't use these terms, or you have some reason to say you are a painter, and then I am interested to know in which way I am a painter.
Uh-huh.
So
Well,
once again, to come back to your question, I think it's not possible to make a connection because when a curator take back Zeman, he's doing a show, and I think the show is a piece of a work of art where every single artist there, it just like I even wrote that directly, a little touch of color to make the full painting or the full sculpture, which is the exhibition. It has nothing to do with one single artist, a man or a woman, who does an exhibition where, in fact, at the end, what that person did is an exhibition because it's not supposed to be anything else except an exhibition. An exhibition signed by who is invited to do the show. But when the organizer who organized the show becomes the only artist, where are the others? Where are the people participating? And of course, when I said it just get worse and worse with the time, a lot of things which were in this article in 72 became the true. When you have a big show at Venice, or in San Paulo, or in Documenta, the only thing people are speaking for days and days when it's a little bit successful, it's about the feeling, about the sensibility, about the stupidity of the organizer. We don't speak anymore about the artists in the show, or we take one or two just to to make sense and to say, it was also some artists showing in this biennale. But who are and who is the topic of the show? The organizer. So that's what I wrote about Zeman in 72, which I saw and was not, I said that again, it looks paradoxical, but it's true, was not so evident with Zeman because I think he was much above to just make a kind of very nice new painting or new work of art.
mm-hmm.
But I think the tendency since Zeman, and he has been the most influential people in that term, was really showing as a caricature what I was already saying at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I was um, trying to pinpoint is that, of course, uh, the curatorial gesture, when it tries to be creative, it can bypass the works, and that's bad. But I think that Zeman started something that is to mix in the curatorial gesture a creative and a critical aspect. And so it's not only the organizer of the show, it's something that through its its conception of the way that he pick up some artists, choose some works, bring them together, create some relations. He is in a way transforming our way of seeing these works. And so there is a creative aspect in it, a development of the work, and bringing it to a different perspective. But that is a big question, and of course there's a lot of exaggeration, there's a lot of inflation of the star curators, and I completely agree with you. And for the football fans, it's a little bit the same. Nowadays we talk much more about the coaches, Klopp and all the big coaches, than the players themselves. But anyway, that's the world we live. But I read Jean-Luc Godard once, and he said that we were born in the museum. This is our land. And he was in an interview, and he said that we were born in the museum, and this is our land. And then, for you as well, the museum is a reference point for art. Can you say that your generation, and instead of moving away from the museum, decided to include the museum in the critical language game of art, not as an institutional accommodation, but as an institutional resetting? Resetting in the sense that the museum is not only a wall, it's much more than that. And we see the works through this place. And this place has a history, this place has, lots of elements that contribute to the way we see the work. And I think that your work is very clever, the way that it is itself your own work, but it's always in this sort of horizontal relationship with the space where it is done and where people deals with it. So a little bit about this, the way that you see the museum in the creation of your own work and the way you see art since the 60s.
I mean, what I understand, it's all depend if people take the museum as something neutral, or if they take it as something not neutral at all. So my position was to always think that the museum is absolutely not a neutral place. It's a very, very tricky place with so many things, from memory to history to manipulation, etc., where at least I was really thinking that 45 years ago. And I don't think exactly the same thing, but this basic way of thinking remained for me quite basic. The museum transforms what is in it if we don't take care of that definitively in something else. So, of course, in front of that, you have at least two solutions. Either you like the fact it's transformed like that and everything is perfect, or you dislike it. And then you have big problem, because either you refuse to show forever with museum because you know that you will be mostly trapped, or you fight against, but you have to react. So I certainly, from the beginning, took the situation not to refuse if I was invited with a museum to exhibit, of course, under minimum condition, but it's always that part which is the easiest, because if someone in a museum invite you, it's because they are interested by what you are doing. It's also why when people were saying, you make a big critique about the museum, but very quickly you get showing with museums. So your critique is really not valid. So of course, it was easy to answer that first of all, they completely mistaken my way of criticism. It was not to say the museum cannot be used. And second of all, they just forgot, which is often the case in the ideology of art, like to see in one part all the people who are, let's say, so-called the public. Then you have another part which are the artists. Then you have another part which are the organizer, etc., etc. And all these parts are shown, or more or less in the common way of thinking, like block. And like block, especially if you go back to the late 60s, 68, etc., that was a block against another block. So very famous at that time in 68, the artists were a block against everything from the museum, showing as a caricature, like the worker was the artist and the patron was the museum. I never believe in such a thing, never, even at this time where I was not yet as much, let's say, developed and beginner. I was saying this is totally bullshit.
Uh-huh.
So we have in certain category, even if we speak politically speaking, you have in the block of the artist the worst reactionary people as the most progressive. In the museum staff and worker in the museum, you have the most reactionary people and the most progressive as well. And when, for example, if you are considered like someone who is a little bit critical, you will find in a museum someone in charge who will see the same thing, might have very similar ideas, but to a part which is different, because to be producer as an artist of objects or whatsoever, and to accept such a work to be part of playing with the museum are two kind of roles which are not possible to interfere or to mix. But these two people are going to the same way. So when, let's say in 69, I was invited by the first director who invited me, who was the director of the very important museum at that time in Europe named Mönchengladbach. His name was Johannes Claders. Johannes Claders, who did for a period of 10, 12 years, an incredible series of exhibition from artists more or less unknown at that time and who became all the stars of today, from Carl André to Joseph Beuys and mentioned, I don't know, Lawrence Weiner, etc., etc. For most of these people, very first show in a museum, it's absolutely no doubt that the way of thinking of that person, being the director of the museum, was absolutely close to the sensibility, not to speak even about the politic, but to the sensibility of what these people in the mid and late 60s were trying to do. So in this group of artists, maybe half of them, maybe a little more, but let's say half of them were more or less against museum. They were critical, etc. But being invited and accepting the show, they were doing all that in complete connection with the person in the museum who was inviting them. And they were able, for that reason, to develop in the best way what they were able to do at that time. So the conflict, people can see, oh, yes, you show in museum, blah, blah, blah. They are speaking from this idea of block against block. And I don't
Yes.
believe on that. And I think it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So it's still true today, even if we can really see a lot of new problems which were not existing 50 years ago in the art world. But it's still absolutely true that, and even maybe more today, because of the multiplication, absolutely phenomenal about the museum. For example, one of the key point of the critique of the museum, at least the one I did in the late 60s, was the fact that the museum was the unique leader to said and to finally select this one is a good artist and the one who is not there doesn't exist. So who was making more or less the final selection for making possible a work to be a little more than just an object? That was the museum.
Hmm.
So this kind of super power was given and was really deserved to the museum and was problematic. Big problem is the fact that if when you are selected, it's already showing that you are good or great, it's really making why you are so good a little less good. So as soon as you realize that, you are into a big challenge with that system. But today, when we have hundreds and thousands of museums, the museum, which I think is in a way very interesting, lost this privilege. The museum is not anymore the place where you have to be and to show and to go or to show if you are an artist, to be respected or to be finally accepted. To show today in a museum, as interesting it can be, it's certainly not making neither your career or to decide that you are a good artist. This is
Hmm.
finished. And I think this is a very interesting change. The museum doesn't is not anymore able to decide uh, who is good, who is bad.
Hmm.
And it's so confusing, as we all know, even if it's not so many people to speak about that, that to go to a museum, you can see absolutely everything. I
Yes.
mean, from the worst to the best, but
Yes.
sometimes without big possibility to really make your own selection because the confusion is extreme.
Yes.
And that is one of the big problem of today, but that's another problem.
Question. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree. And just, well, carry on a little bit with this, the way that your work is, accepting and resetting the institutional logic of the museum and the way that the museum is fostering ways of seeing art. I read uh, a very interesting essay on your work by Dorothea von Huntelmann, the German art critic, and she discusses a lot the way you adopt and bypass the museological conventions of art, especially in what is normally considered its historical and progressive dialectic. So instead of working with in your work, instead of working with the idea of development and progress in art, you produced a work based on repetition and variation. And and so dealing with these two elements, repetition and variation, instead of a development in terms of progression, you uh, you conspire against the idea of retrospective, which is always a progressive way of seeing a work. And I think this is extremely interesting, and I think it was quite clever the way that she was reading your retrospective in the Pompidou as a work, as something that changes the whole view of what a retrospective is and how a retrospective can be a new work. And so it's absolutely unique, and but it needs to have this sort of internal logic of always working with this repetition and variation as a topic. And you have the stripe, you have this outil visuel, and it's always linked with a space and a situation. And so I thought that was quite clever, and I like very much this essay of Dorothea and the way that she's uh, reading the critical aspect of your appropriation of the museum uh, structure and
I
way
think,
of reading.
no, I think it's correct. It's also the reason which from the not maybe the beginning, but very quickly after the beginning, at least when people started to invite me to do, why not to make a big show and to do a retrospective. I don't want to blame the people who said that, because I think it's a way to speak also. But maybe because of that, I immediately realized that all my work pushed myself into a situation where a retrospective, in a general term, not to say when we do a retrospective of whosoever, Van Gogh or Mondrian, we are showing the full spectrum, or at least the full production of these artists. But anyhow, we know what is a retrospective. A retrospective is to try to show all together the maximum of work done by somebody for all his life, all her life, or 10 years, or whatsoever. And I realize, and it's not because repetition of the visual tool, I think, but much more about what is fundamental, the fact that my work has always to deal and always deal with the location, that it is absolutely physically, totally impossible to do a retrospective. And when I said that, it's also the fact that I always prevent a lot of things, like to exhibit pictures, or like to find some ways, etc. So the picture exists, they are in catalogs, they can be in a newspaper, but they are never somewhere in a museum showing what I did in another museum or in the street or wheresoever. So these works, especially the accumulation of these works during already more than 50 years, make today, as much as it was already doing that 10 years after the beginning, an impossibility of enter into this idea of retrospective. And I am not proud of that, or against, but it's a pure fact. And I think such a fact, which in fact she show, she saw very well, uh, it's a signal of something specific. So I agree totally when she realized that the show, as big as it can be, never can be a retrospective, but again, something, brackets, totally new. It's absolutely true.
Uh-huh.
Which means if you take attention of the museum and you accept to show there, even if you are extremely critical about a lot of things which belong to the museum, from the collection of the museum to the way the objects usually collected in a museum are completely under the power, the will, etc., of who belong to the museum as director, sub-director, curator, etc., etc. If you do a work, for example, who escape totally to the possibility of the manipulation by anyone of the museum, you do something which open a question about what the museum is doing every time with all the works which belong to the collection of the museum.
Mm-hmm.
That is just to take an example, but of course, anything you touch will be analyzed to see what the museum can do with that. So in the immediate way, I have nothing, I am absolutely not against, and I have nothing for the museum to collect a work of mine, but the work I will propose will be a work which will, as much as possible, enter all these problems into the flexibility any work can have for a museum, let's say, the function.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you touch of that, of course, uh, I will say many museums are not so excited to buy a work. That for sure. It's automatically a little more difficult than to give something which is an object you can deal as you want. So even on a single object I can do, you have always some principle about the way to show it. And as we know, especially for most of the production, even today, except when the production, and that is no value in my eyes to say it's better or it's not so interesting than a painting, for example. But the principle is, in fact, that somebody buys this work, it can do more or less whatever they want with the work. And if you refuse such a game, and of course the work, it's still possible to be possessed by someone, but especially by a museum, you open another door, and the few museums who accepted this game, when they show my work, they also follow a certain rule, which is totally bizarre or uh, totally breaking. I often, I always think it's clearer when you give an example. The museum in Paris, the Pompidou Museum, at the time of Pontus Sultan, bought several pieces during the years, but the very first time they bought a work which I did specially when it was the construction of the Pompidou Center. And my proposal was, as a work to be part of the collection, was to install in the city of Paris flags on the top of the roof. So the idea was to have a series of minimum 15 flags done specially on top of the roof with one or two visible with your own eyes, and the rest less and less and less visible because of the distance. And on the top floor of the museum, on the three direction, I installed some binocular. And with this binocular and a little map next to the binocular, everyone who wanted can look through, see whatever they wanted, but also see where was the piece they were not able to see with their eyes. So that was the game with a full piece. And that piece, Pont de Sultan, and I have to thanks even him again to accept such a thing, bought this work as part of the collection. And with the piece, I gave a rule what to do with that piece. So the only
A-
way
And
was
how to install it. As-
how to install it and to never, for example, have the use of all these flags and to show it somewhere in the museum, like to say, these are the elements or whatsoever. Everything I could imagine people can do to change the work to make it a little more easy for manipulation is rejected point by point. So what I realized with the time, because that was 77, they tried to show this piece and they succeed 2 times more to show the work. And the 2 times, sorry to say that, where they succeed, it's because I did it myself with the people of the museum. When they wanted to do it by themselves with the curators, etc., believe it or not, was much more difficult, to the point it was impossible to show this work when at the very same time they are able to do something crazy like to climb to the 6th floor 3-ton sculpture, which need a lot of engineering to be able to do it, not to destroy the museum. Successful, possible, no problem. I mean, cost a lot, but it's possible. And just to put these flags everywhere on roof, people will accept to do, unable to do it because they don't even get the energy to follow such a thing, which need at least 5, 6 months to call the people, the owner of the building or a public building, because the idea also was to have half public building and half private building. You have to call, you have to go everywhere. People never answer. Then you have to do it again. And then you have to abandon to find another building. So it's a long process, which is part of the piece, of course. So it's more difficult than to put 3 tons on the 6th floor.
Yeah.
And just to, and of course, we succeed 3 times or 4 times now to make it again visible. But just to see that if you touch, for example, with such a work directly to the rule of the museum, and of course I don't knew it before, when I put all these things, it was part of the piece. And for me, it was clear that it will be as I would like this work to be visible, as long as the museum has this architecture, etc. Because if tomorrow they decide to block the outside of the museum completely, to take out the terraces or whatsoever, my work is out and it will be no way to show the piece. So I guess when they sign the papers, they realize that will be maybe a little difficult for some reason, but they did it. So just to say that the risk is in fact to never have the work shown again, or to make it impossible if the museum change the place. Just that, which is very often. If the museum one day decide it's too small or too old or too whatsoever, and they want to have a new museum for the Pompidou Center, my work will be certainly unable to be seen or to be exhibited. So
And
I think each time if you have and you play with all these, you can see what really means this idea of impossibility of retrospective, because even that work accepted in Paris, Beaubourg, once in a while, cannot be seen in a big show I will do in New York or in Beijing. So retrospective of this work will be impossible. And if you multiply that by hundreds of work, you really realize that it's not one work you cannot exhibit in a retrospective, which can happen to almost any artist, including Picasso. But if it's a majority of the work, the retrospective is totally out of the game.
yeah, that's absolutely unique. That's very nice. Um, I have a quite personal question because when I visited Krasinski's home in studio in Warsaw, beyond being very impressed by his work and existential engagement with the blue line, I liked very much. I was really moved by your interference in the window of this house, and it was such a beautiful dialogue of visual and spiritual energies. Can you talk a bit about your visit there? When was it? Was it in late 70s? And how did you feel this studio, this installation, this work, existential and visual?
You know, this piece was a very special, like always, not special in terms of exquisite, but very specific situation. In fact, it was through a common friend, uh, the invitation to exhibit in Warsaw. I think it was 75 or something like that, when it was extremely difficult, even sometimes impossible, to show in Warsaw, to make a one-man show. And the possibility of doing it was given by the fact that who was living there at that time before Krasinski was the very old and fantastic artist named Staszewski.
Yes.
And Staszewski, who was a friend of Malevich, etc., at a very long period before, uh, was considered into the communist regime as an untouchable guy. You know, they were really taking care of certain person, even if they were brutal with others. And so he knew that if he was doing an exhibition in his apartment, we will be safe. We can do it because that was his place, and that was private. So we we managed to go there, which was not so difficult. And then when I get to his place with everything more or less as you saw it, even with a little more confusion, because at that time the full space was Stajewski, and the person who was helping him was his very close friend Krasinski. So Krasinski was living in a small room at the end of the studio, so he was sleeping there, etc. And they were sharing all the rest. So it was a really living place, extremely full of objects, full of tables and whatsoever. And so getting there, it was a little more difficult than to show in a gallery, as you can imagine. And I thought that the best way to do something was to use all the windows of the space. And so that's what you saw. I use with this special self-gluing paper, the windows with white paper. So you have the white paper, which even bring lights because the white catch the light. And in between two vertical white stripes, you have the view outside. So you see the city, etc., etc. And so that piece was done. They make everything possible to invite people. So it was crowded with people coming for the opening. Some people told me that some of the people in the floor and the pavement were part of the civil police, but they never do or did anything or touch anyone. And we did the opening like it was even difficult to do in a regular gallery. So that is the story in the beginning of the piece. So the years get through, then Stajewski, getting even older and older, died, very, very old, around 95 or something like that. And Krasinski took the place as, I don't know what, as an heritage or as something which was plain before, and became to be the only one living in the place. And the work as being a little decaying after the time, because we speak in a long period, like 40 years or something like that. So I redid the piece later on with Krasinski, who wanted to have it fresh. And so I redid the thing with new paper. And what you saw was certainly during that period. And
Yes.
I know still visible today.
Yes, it is. And it has in the
And oh, the funny thing, I'm just sorry, I just finished with that, which is more or less completely unexpected. This piece was, which has been done as a one-man show in space, uh, turned to be a very long one-man show, as you can imagine, since 75. And then the full apartment started to be a small museum. So it's a complete upside down from what it was and why this work was done.
yeah, what is, I thought was beautiful is that he advanced his line in one of the shades of the window, and so he interacts with your work. It's so nice, and the way that when we are inside and all the lights comes in through your window, your work also interacts with his work. So it's such an interesting and breathing piece that I thought was amazing, and I stayed there really admiring the whole thing. But just moving to the end, I wanted to bring another topic that is mentioned by Dorothea Huntelman. That is the discussion around the idea of the decorative in your work. You do not despise the idea of decorativeness. What you do is to reject contemporary art indifference to it. When I was working myself with Alexander Calder, I did a show of Calder and some Brazilian artists. Uh, I noticed that the critical framework, very influenced by a sort of minimalist ethos, they reject Calder's work in the same basis, saying that it's too decorative, too playful, too beautiful, and they put him aside in in the way that they tell modern and contemporary history. And I think they are too Calvinist to perceive the spiritual dimension of the aesthetic enchantment of Calder's work. And in a way, it seems that to be artistic means to be aesthetically dull, which I think is a big mistake. Can you speak a little bit about the way that you see this decorative aspect as a sort of, well, an aesthetic energy that moves through the work? Or how do you see it?
First of all, I think basically the use of the word decorative, which in the 20th century, from the beginning, just to make a date, it's, as we know, totally pejorative. It's never to say the work is beautiful or whatsoever. It's really to say when you want to say the work is really not interesting, it's easy to say instead, this is decorative. And I think since this word is used, it's a kind of a mistake. I don't want to be too long, so I will do it too, resume. But I think the decorative element in the art history, at least in the Western world, as being up to the conscience of the artist and the conscience of the people interested by art, one of the key elements of what was a painting, a sculpture, whatsoever, in the art production, let's say in the Western world. And then it become, with the same use, of the same word something totally pejorative, decorative, meaningless, which I think it's compared to the art history where we live, where we are, it's totally wrong. It's more or less ignorant. And second of all, I really think if you take the 20th century up to the 60s, 70s, totally wrong too, because the most important artist with a lot of different kind of style and aptitude, etc., of this period in the 20th century are really using and playing a lot with decorative in terms of basic use of the term decorative elements, which I mean at least it's a contradiction. I think, and as you said about Calder, we also know that some of the most important artists of the 20th century have been often criticized or sometimes condemned as mediocre artists because being decorative. And these people were as well Mondrian, Malevich, Matisse. Matisse was certainly the king of the rejection at one point because he used, formally speaking, a lot of decorative aspect in his work. And of course, I think it's comparable to, I don't know, I can mention anyone from the Western world, but it's as fantastic as a painting as Velasquez in a very different, of course, way. So we have this tendency, which is almost absurd, of thinking when we use that word decorative, that means terrible, easy kind of production of art. And then this word being used, it's used often against some of the very major artists of the 20th century, which is another stupidity. Of course, with the time, I don't think today too many people will say that Mondrian is just a decoration on the wall, or Matisse the same, or we can take almost all the great names, and everyone as being falling down at one point to a critique of being decorative. So that being said, and in the way to use it with his historical background, I think decorative, but decorative in term, not pejorative, but what is decor, the decor, decorative, etc., etc. It's one of the very important aspect of the production of visual art. And I think even against sometimes the artists who fight themselves to say, no, no, I am not decorative whatsoever, I will say, if they are good, somewhere they are decorative too.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that even the word aesthetics has been, well, condemned.
Yeah.
So it's a shame. But just to finish, can you talk a little bit about your next show at Nara Heusler? There are new works, there are continuation of their situated works, and the materials, and can you say something about that?
Very little, because I would like to see a little bit about how it's going to look, which I don't know exactly. Uh, we are in this very incredible, I would say, not to make a kind of judgment if it's bad or if it's good, but very, very new situation of not being able to move anymore, at least very difficult to move. And for someone like myself who more or less based my work from the very, very beginning as work in situ, to be not able to move where I work, it's almost a fundamental contradiction. So when I knew that at the very beginning, almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was thinking, okay, it might be for a few months, I don't care. And then little by little, these months became a year and now almost two. I more or less adapt myself uh, by working in distance. So this is very difficult for me. And this is also, how to say it, an exercise. So as an exercise, I was interested to start and to work like that. So I did different exhibitions since I cannot go to the place where I do the show. The very first one was a museum in Italy, in Bergamo, and I did everything, and that was complete rupture. I never been to this museum. I don't know the people who invite me, and I know Bergamo as a city, but that's all. So I have a vague idea of the situation. It was just after the huge, terrible things they have had with the COVID, with the most numerous people dying from it in the early time of the epidemic. So I worked through video conference, not conference, but the possibility to see the stuff, etc., to see the place and to work with the people I don't knew, who more or less under my direction make the show visible. And the result was, to my eyes, not to speak about the people who was impressed by the show, but I think the show was not so bad. But what I can see immediately in what I said, anyhow, it's not impossible to do so, even when you don't know the place, even the people who work to make it possible. But I know by experience that sometime maybe the most interesting thing, which for me will make me the possibility to do something rather new, at least in my work, is only visible through your eyes and not through the film, not through a photo whatsoever. So I know that working like that, I am missing a lot of points which I cannot deal with. So this is a negative element. And for the show now with Nara Rosler, the advantage is the fact that I know the place. So it's not like to see the place today. It's not especially like to see the people today, which is for me part of the exhibition always, and the discussion with the people, etc., etc. But at least it's not like something totally unknown for myself and only known through the photo. Of course, I can work with the plane. I can work with the photo when we will start to make the position of the work. But I know the place, which means I am not completely foreign to the situation. So that just to explain that I am still doing since the beginning of the pandemic some experimental work for myself, which are to work in places I am not there, I don't know the place, or if I know the place, I cannot go there to really fix everything. But I know also it's a kind of a new experience. And what to say about the exhibition itself, it's very difficult because I really have to see how we will manage to, first of all, put some of the thing on the walls. You know, the show I did with, which was in Bergamo, was totally three-dimensional. I did not touch any wall and everything was in the space, which in fact, when I realized it's extremely difficult. And the show we are going to do now in Sao Paulo is very much using the walls.
Hmm.
And I called part of the last exhibition I did high relief. I think this one will be, I don't know in English the name, but I think it's small relief. So it's still a little bit playing to play with the wall and outside a little bit three-dimensional.
And
But
you're using mirror as well? No.
one of the piece use mirror,
Yeah,
but not as systematic as I did it for the last show.
I see. And the works are done in São Paulo, or you made them in Paris and
No,
ship
no,
it?
we do everything in Sao Paulo except
Ah.
myself.